Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Jason Verlinde, who loads of you will know from Fretboard Journal, both the magazine and the podcast and all the various other things they do. Jason, welcome to the podcast. It's a delight to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Matt. I'm honored.
Before we sort of dig in, for those few people who might not have heard of Fretboard Journal, how would you describe it?
Well, it started as a print magazine. We are still a paper-first print publication, which I know is kind of an anomaly in 2024. It was even kind of a backwards move in 2005 when we founded it. Back then, I mean, for decades, people have been saying print is dead. And I've always looked at the magazine racks and newsstands and seen all these beautiful magazines for watches and architecture and interior design and surfing and all these other things and thought, why isn't there a beautiful magazine for guitar fanatics? And so that's how we started in 2005. And as things have unfolded and as media's changed, you know, we've added video and podcast to the portfolio, and now we do this, you know, national event.
And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because to anybody who has an interest in instruments, like beautiful pictures of beautiful instruments alongside kind of interesting copy about them and the people who make them and the people who play them, isn't that like it makes total sense looking back on it that would be an interesting thing for people to want to read. But
I thought so. Yeah. I mean, it is unusual though, because most guitar magazines feature the same, you know, usually the classic rock heroes. They feature the gear reviews or how to play better. And we sort of take this more holistic, less ad-driven approach where, you know, I really, all of it is an excuse to meet the people behind either the instruments or the music. That's really the big bait and switch is, you know, it's really human interest, learning about what motivates players, what motivates these luthiers. We have a lot of fun with it. We take beautiful photos. But yeah, we don't do any of the traditional things that guitar media has focused on over the years.
And it's funny because when I was like a teenager in the 80s in the UK, like buying guitar magazines, there was scope for people to do like a deep dive on 50s Les Pauls or the guitar styles of the Beatles or which guitars Pete Townsend played. But it's slightly dispiriting to see those same things on the cover of magazines now. And obviously, like new generations come along and want to know all this stuff. But it's like, you know, how many different features on Peter Green's Les Paul do you really want to read? And it's also just delightful to see all the, you know, the smaller luthiers and the smaller brands. It's not kind of what a Fender got out this month. It's, you know, there's a whole world out there of cool stuff.
Completely. I mean, my whole goal, you know, I don't know how rampant it was in 2005 when we started, but I want to make editorial that you can't find just with a Google search. And a lot of those, you know, how to sound like Hendrix, top 5 chorus pedals to buy, 5 dreadnoughts under $1,000. You know, some of these stories are just tropes that happen every year. And, you know, now AI is probably generating half of those articles. I want to make, you know, stories and curate content that you're just not going to find anywhere else. And some of those stories, those luthiers, I mean, it's just so fascinating. You know, we've had this close association with bluegrass from the very first issue. We had David Grisman on the cover, and I just love interviewing people about their instruments and interviewing the instrument makers themselves. And it just yields such great content and so many fascinating personalities.
And I think there's that wonderful sweet spot when you do what you do that thing you are doing is not only interesting to like an audience buying it, but actually it feels like you're adding value to the people who you want to feature in it as well. Like, so the luthiers and the players, and they're all just as invested in it as the people buying the final thing.
Yeah, this is not, I often say this is not like fast food journalism. This is sort of the opposite. So it's a very interactive process. We send photographers to either a recording studio where a guitarist or instrumentalist has their gear, or to a luthier's workshop. We try to take beautiful photos. The interviews tend to go on for hours, not minutes. It's a very immersive thing, but then hopefully at the end of the whole cycle, when somebody's holding the print magazine, they feel, the subject and us and our readers all feel like, wow, this is a really special product that just came out.
Yeah, and like that whole, so you'd say 2005, so the magazine will be 20 years old next year.
Hard to believe.
and how much of the sort of the instrument and luthier world did you know when you went into that? Obviously enough to want to do it, but what was the sort of what was it you were looking to explore at that point?
I think that in 2005, the backstory of the Fretboard Journal is I used to work for Amazon. I actually came from the world of digital, like .com, e-commerce, to do this sort of, very traditional leaning media company. I worked for Amazon for 7 years. I helped them launch their music store. And during those 7 years, I definitely did not get rich as some of my peers did, but I had enough spending money that I could buy like a nice Martin D15 at the time. And I kind of became enamored with, at the time, Mandolin Brothers still sent out their catalog, and Elderly Instruments was one of the first, online websites that really had, great descriptions about their gear. And I just soaked it all in. I bought that Martin. I bought a Mana White Gibson A3 mandolin. Those like beautiful 1919 A-style mandolins. And I just was like, from a rather modest budget, just sort of like loving it all. I don't think I knew, beyond Collings and some other brands, just how rich the world of handmade guitars was. That seemed like a pretty rarefied world. But as you do these interviews, I mean, it's not a far trek to, interview Richard Hoover of Santa Cruz Guitars and then interview somebody who worked for Richard Hoover and now works by themselves, making beautiful guitars. And so the whole network is so connected. You sort of just fall into it. It's amazing.
Yeah, I just sort of found that doing this podcast is you go in with like some interests and some areas to kind of explore, and you just start pulling on threads, and something leads you to something else, which leads you to something else, and you end up in this like really rich world of interconnected stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I really feel lucky that this is my job, and that I'm able to share these stories and be a fly on the wall, and in some way kind of translate that to a bigger audience, because it's a blast.
And does it feel like you're sort of talking about some of those brands that were around 20 years ago? Does it feel like there's been some developments in the handmade acoustic instrument world in those 20 years? Because it feels to me at this point there's like a golden age of this stuff going on, and it may just be that the internet makes it more visible, but it just feels like there's a whole world out there of people who want decent acoustic instruments and are, but also it's possible to buy a relatively good instrument relatively cheap these days compared to when I was a teenager, and then at any point beyond that you want to go to, really.
Yeah, I mean, it continues to evolve. It's fascinating because, one word that you just used, the word handmade. I mean, that's sort of being, I feel like, phased out, because you've got big brands making incredibly exquisite instruments, and they're being open. Like, yeah, we use a CNC for part of this. You also got brands like Collings with Waterloo, Circle Strings making Iris guitars. You've got these guitar companies that are known for, guitars that used to cost $5,000 or $6,000 doing these more modest $2,000, $3,000 guitars. And then you've got this whole, world of builders of the Instagram generation. And you've got, you can go on to Instagram and have your entire feed be handmade or boutique level guitars and be a kid in the candy store that way. And so there's all these little niches. There's still the, traditional leaning finger style and flat picking, folks trying to replicate a classic Martin style. But then you've got all these other tentacles going. And it is this like really rich time.
We'll be right back with you just after this. Collings Guitars has been a long-time supporter of the bluegrass community, from collaborating with artists to sponsoring festivals big and small, and now by sponsoring Bluegrass Jam Along. Handmade in Austin, Texas, every Collings guitar and mandolin that leaves the shop is built from the sound up, and the team loves seeing a Collings in the hands of players of all levels, from local musicians to world-renowned pickers. Visit collingsguitars.com for more. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com. And the mandolin world is it's a funny one because they're so much more complicated and expensive to make. Like you can't churn them out in the way you can churn out guitars. But there's a fascinating array of people out there doing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I love about, I think we are not a strict bluegrass magazine, but we love bluegrass and it's a fair percentage of our magazine every year. And what I love about it is that you have these little subsets like the world of F5 mandolins and banjos to a certain extent, where these are players and builders who are so passionate about dialing in that tone and so exacting. And you get incredible stories talking about these, fairly niche instruments that you just would never find in other subsets of the general music population. So I love celebrating bluegrass music. And yeah, mandolins is like it's a whole nother world unto itself. Lots of builders, a fair number of builders in the mandolin world are fetching, $10,000 or $20,000 for their new instruments, which is a pretty rare thing in the world of guitars. But mandolins, it's its own universe.
Yeah, and it's hard to make a cheap mandolin, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
And do you feel like curious to sort of know what the sort of state of the vintage market was around that point? I remember like in the 90s going guitar shopping and there being like stuff around. You could buy a new guitar or you could buy something from like maybe the late 60s, early 70s, and they'd probably cost around the same amount of money. And there wasn't that massive veneration, but it just as the 40s and 50s things get so out of people's budgets, then the 60s and 70s things suddenly become a lot more highly thought of than they were 20 years ago. And then at some point, the 80s things will start to move into that bracket. And does it feel like the vintage market has kind of changed much in those 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm now 50 years old, so I guess I'm vintage, and I think people of whatever the current generation is, where you have a job and you have some disposable income, are going to gravitate towards the instruments and the cars of their youth that they eyed. I think that's always going to be the case. So yeah, I remember, 20 years ago going into a Guitar Center and seeing, early 70s, late 60s Fenders for sale for, had I the foresight, I would have snatched them all up, now those guitars have, gained value exponentially, whether or not they needed, should have. But yeah, as 50s and 60s instruments and, if we're talking about acoustic instruments as guitars from the 30s and 40s have gone up in value, sometimes dramatically. Yeah, all of these newer vintage things sort of become collectible. There is a fine line, though, because, as you said, we are in this sort of golden age, and there are some tremendous builders right now, making guitars that definitely hold their own. So at some point you have to go, do I really need the 1974 Martin, or should I use that money to buy, from this new person?
Well, and it's really interesting that there's been people kind of making that sort of holy grail pre-war Martin tone or whatever. People like looking for that, but then in recent years, people have also started making guitars that look old as well, and that's been around in the electric world for a while. But I talked to Alistair Atkin from Atkin Guitars a couple of weeks ago, and seeing what they're doing and what pre-war are doing, and like there's this whole sort of branch of the acoustic world now that is about using modern techniques to make old-sounding, old-looking guitars.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like pre-war was sort of the first ones on that front to really make a go of it. I'm sure there were some others before then. They sort of made it maybe a little more acceptable because their guitars were just so good. But yeah, now, Atkin, you've got Wandering Boy in Australia making, these sort of recreations of 20s Stellas and parlor guitars, blues guitars. I think from the builder's perspective, sometimes they're able to actually get a little bit more out of the guitar when they don't make the finish exquisite. They're able to make a guitar with a lighter finish. Maybe it's got some imperfections, but it's older wood. I don't think them necessarily dragging a Ziploc of nails or keys across the, fingerboard and body results in a better tone, but I think sometimes they can be a little bit freer to pick woods where it's like, okay, this isn't meant to look perfect. I'm going to put some wear on it to begin with before it even sees the customer. So it does seem to yield sometimes, maybe more often than not, a great guitar. But, guitarists tend to be pretty traditional, and this has been a hot button issue.
Well, that's it, isn't it? It's just, we've had nearly a year of dreadnought guitar shapes being around now, and they are still, guitar is the instrument that sells more than anything else, and dreadnoughts are the guitar that sell more than any other shape. And, people have come along and done all sorts of different stuff since. And like electric guitars have, you could go through the decades and see the styles evolve in terms of electrics. But acoustics are still, people essentially still want the same thing they wanted back in the 20s and 30s.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, guitarists, for all the innovation and all the amazing musicians that we all cherish right now, are a pretty traditional lot.
And that's one of the interesting challenges for the guitar makers, particularly, is that idea of a dreadnought that is made of either rosewood and spruce or mahogany and spruce. Like, we're having to look at different woods, and we're having to, and some people are just looking for the very next most similar version of that, and some people are wandering out and looking, well, what else can we play with then? If people are going to have to buy different things, what's good?
Completely. Yeah. I mean, there's I wish it were moving a little faster, but there's a lot being done on the sustainable domestic, wood front in terms of guitars. I mean, Collings is coming out with the Pecan, I saw, back in size, which is kind of unusual. Jane Henderson, Wayne Henderson, a lot of people probably listening to this podcast know who Wayne Henderson is. Jane, his daughter, is really bent on using sustainable woods, domestic woods, when at all possible. But it requires a musician, a customer who's, open to that, because so many have just desired that D18 or that D28 that, they've stared at for decades now, and that's their dream guitar.
Yeah. It's be interesting to see where we go with that, because there must be so much out there that's just being underutilized at this point. Maybe the next 10 years would be really cool to see where we end up.
Yeah, for sure. And it's gonna, it's not as easy as just deciding that you're going to make this wood, because it really comes down to the supplier side and finding guitar shaped wood, wood that is wide enough for a guitar body is one of the challenges. And when you get into some of these really niche things, it really takes a visionary on the sawmill side before the guitar maker can even do anything with it.
Yeah. One of the other things that I really enjoy about Fretboard Journal is that you will send out musicians to interview other musicians, or you will it's almost like getting to listen in to a conversation between two people deeply involved in that world, which is just a real treat. It's like you're sort of eavesdropping on somebody's conversation almost.
Yeah, we've done that since pretty much our first or second issue. I think it was in the first issue we had Nico Case interviewing Charlie Leuven of the Leuven brothers. And that sort of set this template that we've tried to do as many times as we can. Oftentimes it's super difficult. Artists have busy touring schedules. We've probably attempted more of these than we've ever been able to publish. Sometimes they go nowhere. Sometimes they're amazing, though. Sam Bush interviewing Tim O'Brien, Bill Frisell interviewing Danny Barnes. They've yielded so many. And I'll give you a scoop that in our winter issue, I haven't even told any of our readers this. Critter, Chris Eldridge, just interviewed his guitar hero, Eric Johnson. And so there's a really cool where, Critter looked up to Eric for years growing up. Eric obviously deeply rooted in the world of electric guitars, and they just spent a few hours at Eric's studio geeking out. And from what I understand, I haven't seen the story yet, but Critter was asking him all about pedals and amps, and Eric was asking Critter all about acoustics. And so it was kind of a cool, it'll be a cool interview.
It's really cool. Things like that sort of cross lines that you wouldn't expect are always interesting as well. I remember talking to Bryan Sutton at one point, and he was saying that when Paul Gilbert sort of joined Artist Works as an instructor, he was like, I'd love to chat to him because I was such a big fan of, and like Bryan Sutton being an Eddie Van Halen fan or a Paul Gilbert fan or whatever, or it's the stuff that that's such interesting stuff.
It's so interesting, and it's great because it tends to take the focus away from the traditional things talked about during a publicity cycle of like, tell me about your new record. An artist, of a certain stature talking to another artist who's maybe their hero, you get all sorts of questions you would have never imagined, some of which, you or I might be embarrassed to ask. But when it's, a peer asking them something, it magic often ensues. Like you get this incredible dialogue. It's so fun.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You can always tell. There's nothing more disappointing than reading an interview with somebody that you're fascinated by, but the interviewer doesn't know enough to ask the right questions. It's like it can be really disappointing. But exactly that thing you talked about. I had Chris Eldridge on the podcast recently, and we just talked about Bela Fleck's Drive album for an hour, and like having a conversation about somebody else's music, not his. Made for a I think I'm going to do some more of those on the podcast. Just get some musicians in and go pick a record, and we'll talk about it because it just goes off in a direction that you'd never get to otherwise.
Yeah, that's the best, and you do a great job with that. I've listened to a whole bunch of your episodes over the years, and you do a tremendous job at that. And I think that's kind of as we do podcasts, we've got now a whole family of podcasts. I really want them to be kind of loose conversations where there's not necessarily a strict outline. I think the worst interviews, like you said, are the folks who either are not knowledgeable about the artist they're interviewing, or also that they have this sort of preconceived, like, I've got to ask these 8 questions, what's your favorite string gauge? What were you doing on, what guitar? And it just sort of derails whatever flow a conversation would naturally have. There's plenty of interviews like that around. So I try to go into an interview prepared and knowing what to expect and where it might lead, but I also let's just go wherever it's going to go.
Yeah, and they're great for that very reason. I enjoy your podcast hugely. And there was one you did with Chris Thiele when Lay Songs came out. That was very much about, you've got a new record out, tell me about that. But then ended up with a whole chunk of the conversation about the fact that the jig was out in the factory when a lot of the lower mandolin fretboards were cut. And then it devolved into this conversation about authenticity versus playability with instruments, which is fascinating. And he's got some very strong opinions on it. And that was really cool because I've not heard him talk quite that way about that before.
Yeah. I mean, more recently, a favorite interview I just did, it came out a couple of weeks ago, was, John Monteleone, who's like one of the great archtop guitar makers living, just an absolute incredible human being. His instruments fetch 6 figures. On Facebook Marketplace here in Seattle, where I live, there's a banjo that he converted to a 5-string neck when he worked for Mandolin Brothers, and it's been for sale for weeks. And I just wanted to ask him about that, before we started talking about all the archtops that he's built, or this museum that's, celebrating his output in New York, and got just some incredible stories about, his time at Mandolin Brothers and the decision when he finally made, the decision of like, why do I keep putting Gibson on the headstocks of these instruments I'm, recreating or working on? I'm going to put Monteleone on them. And, that sort of light bulb moment, because there was that era in the 70s where all these great, luthiers were taking old, either tenor banjos and turning them into 5-string banjos to meet the needs of bluegrass players, or, converting Martins in some cases, the archtop Martins to flat tops. And so, yeah, I mean, it is fun to just kind of, have these little instrument diversions where you kind of have this like a perfect icebreaker.
Yeah. And just like getting into all that detail. And I think it's one of the joys of a podcast, because it is quite an intimate thing. Like as somebody as listening to a podcast, you're just there with sort of one person in each ear, and it's a totally, you can go to places with a podcast sometimes that don't translate necessarily in print, or if you're watching somebody's face while they're talking to you, there's some I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's some space to play around with that doesn't exist somewhere else, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a challenge, because so many podcasts are moving to video right now, because YouTube's algorithm is obviously so robust, and you get all these views. Even if you just post the audio file, you get a whole bunch of views on YouTube or listens on YouTube that you wouldn't get otherwise. But yeah, there's an intimacy, and people put their guard down when they know that they're not looked at for an hour. That is one of from the earliest days of the Fretboard Journal. Interviewing some of my heroes for the magazine is sort of like, be as inobtrusive as possible, put the microphone and then forget about the microphone. Don't wear headphones, just try to have an actual conversation. And usually if you do it right, within 5 or 10 minutes, people forget that they're being recorded, and you get all these great stories.
Yeah. And I love that Fretboard Journal as a kind of like an umbrella now, rather than just a magazine, has become about different ways of telling all these interconnected stories. Because the kind of stories you tell in the magazine, there's stories you can tell on the podcast that are a bit different. And there's the podcast, you have several.
We do.
But there's also the dimension of the kind of Fretboard Summit as well, and a kind of in-person community kind of vibe going on. When did you start doing that?
So the first Fretboard Summit was back in 2015, and it was my take on the TED Talks. TED Talks were kind of big back then. I think they still are. But, as from doing all these hundreds of interviews, you build up this community, and you have these people that you're talking to sometimes regularly that you could have never imagined in your wildest dreams are in your contact list. And I looked at the pages of our magazine, and I loved it. I loved all the colorful characters. I loved getting to know, like Bill Collings, late great Bill Collings, larger than life characters. These people have huge personalities. And it always just felt like a kind of a shame of like, oh, well, we'll do our, a beautiful 20-page feature on them for one issue. But then do I never get to talk to them again? Do our readers never get to hear from them again until we decide to do another one of those? So it's almost like a family reunion of sorts. The first Fretboard Summit was 2015. I just emailed everyone I could who I thought would make for a great, music festival. And during the day, we had pretty geeky talks about guitar construction and, famous people in the lutherie world like T.J. Thompson and Richard Hoover of Santa Cruz Guitars talking about, either, the early days of Martin guitars or whatever. And then at night, there were sort of these all-star jams. And I was shocked and surprised that, all the people that I emailed for that first year kind of showed up with not much promise of money or fame or riches or anything. Bryan Sutton was there. Bill Frisell was there. David Crosby showed up. I think I gave we gave David Crosby a $500 budget for, his travel expenses. And he had to rent or charter a plane to get to this thing in time. Like blew through that budget before he ever even got on the plane. And it was just this magical, weird, surreal weekend where, only a couple hundred people, came because it was a first year event. But then you had, Bill Frisell and David Crosby trading guitars, and you had Blake Mills and all these like inspiring artists. Courtney Hartman was there. There was an all-star jam of all of them playing Sitting on Top of the World that is on YouTube now. We did that for 2 years, where we would rent a resort or a part of a hotel and try to fill it with all of our favorite people. And it was so cost prohibitive. I mean, it was just stupid to do it, but it was magical. And after 2 years of doing that, I kind of shelved the idea. The people I worked with shelved the idea. It was just like, this is amazing. We got some great content out of it, life-changing experiences, but like, we can't just keep hemorrhaging money to do a party every year. And then if during the middle of the lockdown, a guy from the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago, which is this like incredible, very one of a kind institution of it's a music school in Chicago, a brick and mortar music school with dozens of classrooms and 2 stages and a bar and thousands of students going through their halls every week. He reached out. He was a guitar fan and a Fretboard Journal fanatic. And he said, I run this school and we go dark every summer for 1 week. Do you want to, fill our halls, take over the space for this Fretboard Summit idea he used to run? And so this will be our 3rd year doing it there. And it's been a game changer. It's a success for both of us. It brings a whole bunch of people from around the world to Old Town School of Folk Music who wouldn't normally know about it. It brings some great artists to their venue. And, it's kind of the perfect setting for a gathering of, 400 guitar fanatics. They also have enough room that we're able to showcase a lot of these luthiers. So we have around 80 exhibitors this year. Everyone from, independent builders who build maybe 10 or 12 instruments a year to Northfield mandolins and Collings. Gallagher guitars, Doc Watson's guitar of choice, are making a comeback at this year's summit and showcasing what they're up to now. Martin will be there. Gibson is sponsoring it. Like, it's snowballed into this thing beyond my wildest dreams. And it works. I'll be perfectly honest. I'm based in Seattle, Washington. I grew up in California. Like, Chicago is not necessarily, it never felt like anything in my DNA. But having done 2 events there now and this 3rd one in just a couple of weeks, like it feels like a home away from home. It's a pretty amazing thing that's happened.
That's incredible. It's like you were saying before about you do these things and you build up a network of people and some contacts and community, and surprising things come out of doing what you do. Things just sort of slot into place sometimes.
Yeah. And the fun thing that, is happening now that we're, this is technically our 5th Fretboard Summit, but our 3rd in Chicago. The fun thing that's happening is we're hearing from artists and builders who just want to come. Like, it's not a transactional thing. Mm. It's not, one more tour date for them. They're asking me like, hey, can you put me in? What can I do? I really love to come this year. And so, that's kind of a fun, change where, we've got artists approaching us, which is really neat.
And there's, something really cool about, because, wherever you are in the world, and even if you're in the US and near some of these builders and near some stockists, like, you look at the magazines and you see stuff online, but it's like watching a cookery show where you can't eat the food. Like, reading about a guitar and looking at a guitar is great fun, but you want to pick it up and play it or hear somebody else play it. Or so just the opportunity to be in a room that has all those guitars in it. It's, like, not many stores carry that bigger range of that kind of guitar.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that there has been this large of a lutherie showcase in North America in a long time, and again, we didn't set out the first year we did this in Chicago. I think we had 40 builders. We've doubled that, and we have some bigger brands now. And the coolest part for me about the Fretboard Summit is, in addition to meeting the luthiers, who are all amazing, they all have stories. They all should eventually be in the Fretboard Journal. No one gets into the world of guitar or mandolin making without some fascinating backstory that brought them to that point in life. Yeah. The other cool thing is, the leaders, the CEOs, the heads of these brands come to this event because it's a huge networking opportunity. So it's not like you're just going and meeting some regional sales rep from Martin. You're meeting like Thomas Ripsum, the CEO of Martin, is coming and fielding questions. Bob Taylor of Taylor Guitars and Andy Powers come every year. Steve McCreary and, his crew at Collings come to the summit, and not only come to the summit, for the last 2 years, they've actually unveiled guitars that no one had ever seen before, twists on their existing models, matching pairs. They've made these exclusive instruments. I don't even think they do that for the NAMM show, and they do it just because they seem to have fun at the event. So yeah, it's a pretty special thing, and I don't take it for granted. It's really a neat experience.
And this year's is coming up pretty soon, right?
Yeah, it's August 23rd. So I think officially after this week, I go into my like COVID lockdown bubble where I can't catch any illness or disease because I can be healthy when I get to Chicago. But it starts August 23rd at the Old Town School of Folk Music. It's fretboardsummit.org. On the bluegrass front, literally just yesterday, we finally locked in. Jake Eddy is coming back. Jordan Tice will be there. Cameron Noller.
Oh, cool.
And then a whole bevy of, bluegrass leading instrument makers too.
And what else have you got sort of beyond the bluegrass thing? Because I'm well aware that lots of people who listen to this podcast aren't just bluegrass fans. What else have you got going on this year?
Oh my gosh. The list is very long. We've crammed more into this 3-day weekend than anyone rightfully should. So, we've got Blake Mills, incredible musician who was actually at that first Fretboard Summit we threw, coming back. Joe Henry, incredible singer-songwriter, coming back to the summit. He was also at that very first one. Colin Hay from Men at Work is playing the second night. Adam Levy and Rich Hinman, who incredible instrumentalists, are going to be playing. We've got Valerie June performing on Sunday, and Joel Patterson, who kind of does this like retro jazz guitar thing. Just so, he sounds like Les Paul. It's incredible. Molly Miller. I'm going to forget a whole bunch of names, but it's a staggering number of musicians, and including some folks who aren't officially on the schedule, but are just kind of attending. And, we do have rooms and spaces where jams can kind of just erupt like a good bluegrass festival. So TBD what happens there, but it's going to be kind of a wild weekend. And then, like I said, TJ Thompson on the guitar maker front. TJ Thompson comes back every year. He's sort of this next level guitar repair guru, as well as a maker, if you're very lucky, of exquisite Martin style guitars. I think he only makes a couple a year. They fetch seriously big bucks, for those who are lucky enough to convince him to make one. Richard Hoover of Santa Cruz Guitars will be there. The Collings crew, like I said, Martin's CEO. It's sort of this very immersive thing where if you want to go and learn about the craft of guitar making, if you want to just try out guitars, or you want to be a better player, like pretty much every hour you have a hard decision to make. You have one of those options. And then starting around 5 p.m., the music kicks in. So
yeah, I've not really experienced anything quite like that. And I went out to IBMA last year, and I'm out there again this year, just to sort of be in a place that's, because I sit and do these chats, and I'd come downstairs and tell the people in my house who I've been talking to, and nobody has any idea what I'm talking about. Like, none of my friends have any interest in any of the things. Like, I have many interests they share, but this is not one of them. And just to find yourself in a room full of people who share the things, there must be people who come to the summit who like meet each other and then go off and form friendships and keep in touch. And
oh yeah, I've gotten so many letters from people who said, I was in an elevator with Bob Taylor of Taylor Guitars, and we started talking about supply chain stuff, and I'm in the sprinkler business. You get these wild stories of people bonding with some of their guitar making and guitar playing heroes, and it's a pretty special thing. And the summit is, I think our biggest challenge is it's kind of hard to market because it is unlike any other thing out there. It's not a traditional music festival. It's not necessarily just a Lutherie showcase. We feature vintage instruments as well as new instruments. It is this sort of uniquely curated weekend that, if you get the Fretboard Journal, you know exactly what you're getting into. But for folks who maybe are hearing about it for the first time, it is unlike anything else out there. And I take pride in that, but it does make it really hard sometimes to explain it to people. I can't just say, oh, it's like, going to Wintergrass. It's different.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very much like a physical manifestation of like the Fretboard Journal as a magazine, a thing that didn't exist. And, it's good compared to if you were to set out and create a thing, that might not be where you end up, but it's just an amalgamation of all the things that you care about put in one place. And that's what we need more of in the world. There's so many experiences or products or things you can get that are just like a thing that exists already that's slightly different, or a thing that's there to fill a need that nobody really has, like it fixes a problem nobody's got. Whereas things like this,
there's a lot of that.
But stuff like this, I think really positive energy coalesces around stuff like this, because people, like, when you realize you need this thing, you're so grateful it's there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a total labor of love, and my goal with the summit in particular, and with the magazine is kind of a unique proposition, which is, can this be an enjoyable experience even if you're not in the market to buy something, and that's sort of contrary to so much of what we see in media these days, where it's just buy this. Have you seen the new thing from here? And, I want people to immerse, even if you have no inclination to ever order a banjo, I want you to learn about some fascinating individual who's making, banjos and what drives them. And then you go home and you have this sort of, cocktail party tidbit in your head for the rest of your life about this guy you'll never meet. But it's still, it fills your soul a little bit.
I think that's a really interesting point, is like you do get guitar magazines that are reviews of guitars and pedals and amps and stuff,
sure,
with no sort of story behind it, really, other than like whatever the marketing department have concocted to try and sell it. And it's like, I remember buying a hi-fi years ago and buying a couple of hi-fi magazines. I'm like really geeking out on them and really enjoying them. But then buying a hi-fi and going, well, I don't need to buy those anymore because they're just a bunch of stuff I'm never going to buy. But I own, how many guitars do I own? I own 4 guitars, and I'm not in the market for a guitar. But I could happily sit and look at guitars I'm never going to buy until the cows come home. Like it's a different thing, particularly when you get that element of a story behind it. Like when you delve into the Collins story and you hear about Bill and some of the things that matter to him, and when you see the people behind the instruments and why it matters to them, then it's that the instrument itself is only half the story, really.
Yeah, but it's so rich. And, this is the thing I love about bluegrass and why I love going to, a good bluegrass festival is you see these instruments getting played as tools, and you'll see a 30s Martin alongside, maybe a cheap import. But you actually see these instruments get used, and it's a magical thing that, doesn't necessarily exist in other genres of music, where you've got these passionate builders and you've got these passionate players, and I love nothing more than, even though I love your original premise, because I'm one of these like very introverted, shy. I would never go to a jam circle at a bluegrass festival. I'd be too intimidated. There's etiquette there. There's maybe with enough practicing, jamming along with what you've done, it would be doable. But I love just witnessing and soaking that all in, because you don't see that in other genres. You wouldn't find, 3 electric guitarists in a circle at a rock festival jamming together, and one of them has a Blackguard Telecaster and the other one has some, import Squire or something. It just doesn't exist anywhere. But in bluegrass, you see the instruments up close getting used, and you hear, all the builders are chasing some tone or volume, that they've been chasing for decades. It's kind of cool.
And there's something like, I mean, I'm fascinated by guitars and amps and, electrics and all of that, but there's something about the acoustic side of things where the tone essentially, like you've got strings and you've got picks and bits and pieces, but the tone essentially comes from the instrument and the person who's playing it. And so it's just it feels like there's such a direct line between the soul of the instrument through the personality of the human being who's playing it into your ears. That's so kind of direct. There's sort of nowhere to hide,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think the Fretboard Journal is known for is our longstanding friendship with the guitarist Bill Frisell. And, Bill, for over a decade, lived not a short walk from where the Fretboard Journal is headquartered in Seattle, Washington. So he would stop by and we became really good friends. And I would, without being a total irritant, say, "Hey, Bill, like, can we shoot a video of you in this corner?" And now I don't know how many. There's probably 15 solo Bill Frisell videos on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, as well as some collaborations that we've asked him to do over the years. We just posted one today of him playing Stardust, and I now have witnessed Bill play, I don't know, a dozen different guitars, including some of my own personal instruments. And it always sounds like Bill Frisell, whether it's a Telecaster or an L00 or some random guitar that a manufacturer just sent us to kind of try out for a while. It's unmistakably Bill, no matter what the format. So yeah, it is all in the player's hands.
And I love it. It's what you were saying about the sort of festivals and like just that image of three rock guitarists getting together at a festival with like a telly and a squire. Like they wouldn't even know what to play, because like, there's something beautiful about that as well, about the bluegrass thing and jazz to a certain extent, is you can go anywhere in the world and meet some people and within 2-3 minutes be having a musical conversation because you've got this shared kind of repertoire you can at least use as a jumping off point, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's a little, one of the things that's intimidating for new bluegrass players is like, what? I got to learn this fiddle? Like, I've never heard any of these songs on the radio. But yeah, once you immerse yourself in it, you see the nuance, you see, the key that it's in, and it's because it unlocks this whole universe.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So you started kind of a print magazine in a digital world. You sort of started an event bringing people together, in a world where increasingly that stuff happens online, and you've got this sort of increasing roster of podcasts. I mean, I don't know how you fit it all in. Just like having a job and running one podcast is astonishing. But are there more areas to explore, or do you feel like your cup is fairly full now in terms of?
I mean, I am very overextended. You can ask my wife; she would tell you. But yeah, I get a lot of help. The podcasts, I'm not going to put out any more podcasts where I'm the host. We have other hosts, and that's been great. We have a steel podcast that just launched a little while ago for steel guitar players. I do primarily the Fretboard podcast, as well as this Truth About Vintage Amps podcast, which is a whole nother, weird niche unto itself with its own fan base. The event in Chicago is definitely an annual tradition that I, will continue to curate. Beyond that, I think we're going to probably do maybe a book a year, maybe a deeper dive than even the magazine goes into certain subsets of this little community. But I'm pretty happy with where things are. I mean, I think the goal now is just to kind of grow the magazine base and the podcast base, and we'll probably still do more with video. That gets super complicated, obviously, because if you're at all like I am, you immediately are like, okay, I'm going to need these cameras, I'm going to need this video crew, and it just sort of snowballs into network television all of a sudden, and you're like, I just wanted to capture a little video once in a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, for now, I've got plenty of great stories in the magazine. We've got plenty of great podcasts on the horizon, and this Fretboard event in Chicago.
Well, it's really cool. I mean, the summit sounds amazing. Hopefully one year I'll get out and come and experience it for myself.
Please.
But like in the meantime, keep doing what you're doing, because this is one of the things that does fill a need that people have that they can't get anywhere else. And it's just, it's a joyful set of stuff that you're putting out into the world. And it's been really...
Oh, thank you.
It's been really cool getting to talk to you. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. I've enjoyed, like I said, I listen to your podcast as much as I can, and I love what you're up to as well.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.